For 40 years, I shared my land with a tribe of 8 Bigfoot. What they offered me in exchange for sanctuary is something that saved my farm 3 times over and changed everything I thought I knew about intelligence, loyalty, and survival. Some people might call me foolish for admitting this publicly, but after 4 decades of keeping this secret, I believe someone needs to know the truth before it's too late. My name is Robert Cartwright. I'm 68 years old, and I'm a 3rd-generation cattle farmer from the Cascade foothills of Northern California. This is my story, and I need to tell it exactly as it happened. The spring of 1984 arrived with more than just melting snow and budding oaks. It brought the weight of my father's death and 640 acres of struggling ranch land that suddenly belonged to me. I was 28 years old, fresh out of agricultural college at UC Davis, and completely unprepared for the reality of running a cattle operation that had been bleeding money for 3 years straight. My father had been too proud to tell me just how bad things had gotten. The bank statements I found in his desk drawer told a different story than his reassuring phone calls ever had. The property sat in a valley where the Sacramento Plains began their climb toward the Cascades, a patchwork of rolling pastures bordered by dense Douglas fir and ponderosa pine forest on the north side. It was beautiful land, the kind that had been in our family since 1889, but beauty doesn't pay the bills. I had 120 head of cattle, aging equipment, and a mortgage that demanded attention I wasn't sure I could give it. By May, I was learning just how much I didn't know. The cattle kept breaking through the fence line on the north pasture, the section that butted up against the heavily forested area we'd always called the back 40. It happened 3 times in 2 weeks, and each time I'd spend hours rounding them up, driving my pickup along dirt roads that barely deserved the name, cursing my father for not replacing those fence posts when he should have. On May 18th, I lost 3 cows to a ravine I didn't even know was there. Found them at the bottom, necks broken, a financial loss I could not afford. I spent that entire weekend repairing the fence line, sinking new posts, stringing fresh wire until my hands were raw and bleeding. It was exhausting work, made worse by the knowledge that I was doing it alone, that there was no one to call for help, no father to show me the tricks he'd learned over 40 years of ranching. I finished Sunday evening just as the sun was setting behind the tree line, stood back to admire my work, and drove home convinced I'd solved the problem. Monday morning, I headed out to check the fence at first light, half expecting to find it trampled again. What I found instead stopped me cold. The fence was still intact, but a section about 20 yards from where I'd been working had been reinforced. Not by me. Someone or something had woven fresh branches through the wire, creating additional support. 3 fence posts that had been leaning at precarious angles were now perfectly straight, braced with heavy limbs that looked like they'd been deliberately placed. The craftsmanship was better than mine. I stood there in the early morning mist, my coffee thermos forgotten in my hand, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles away, old Ed Morrison, who was 83 and could barely walk to his mailbox. This wasn't his work. This wasn't anyone's work that I could explain. The ground around the repairs was soft from recent rain, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Massive footprints, easily 16 inches long, pressed deep into the mud. They had 5 toes, a broad heel, and looked disturbingly human in shape, just impossibly large. I knelt down, pulled out my pocket measuring tape, the same one my father had carried. 16.5 inches long, 7 inches wide at the ball. I took photographs with the Canon AE-1 I kept in the truck for documenting cattle injuries for insurance purposes. My hands were shaking. In all my years growing up on this land, in all my father's stories, nothing had prepared me for this. Over the next 2 weeks, it kept happening. The water trough in the east pasture that had been leaking from a cracked seam was suddenly sealed with pine pitch, applied so expertly it looked professional. A gate that had been hanging crooked on broken hinges was rehung, the old hinges replaced with what looked like hand-carved wooden pins that worked better than the originals. Each time, I'd find those same massive prints in the soil nearby. I started checking the fence line every evening, driving out just before dusk. On the night of June 3rd, I was checking on Bessie, a pregnant Hereford who was close to calving. The light was fading fast, that golden hour when the world seems caught between day and night. That's when I saw it. At the tree line, maybe 60 yards away, stood a figure. At first, my brain tried to rationalize it as a person, maybe a very tall person in a dark coat. But as I watched, frozen beside my truck, it shifted, and I realized nothing human had shoulders that broad or stood that tall. 8 feet, maybe more, covered in dark brown hair that seemed to absorb the fading light. It was watching my cattle, just standing there, observing. Not threatening, not approaching, just watching, with what seemed like careful attention. We stayed like that for what might have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes, time losing meaning in that suspended moment. Then, without any sudden movement, it turned and disappeared into the forest. I heard the sound of something large moving through undergrowth, branches breaking, then silence. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, looking at the photographs I'd taken of those footprints, thinking about the repairs, about that figure in the tree line. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I loaded a bucket with apples from the tree behind the house and a 5-gallon jug of fresh water, drove out to the north fence line, and left them on a flat boulder near where I'd seen the most tracks. I didn't leave a note or say anything aloud. I just left them there and drove away. When I returned the following morning, the bucket was empty and the water was gone. But in their place, arranged carefully on the boulder, was a bundle of plants I didn't immediately recognize. I took them to the County Agricultural Extension Office, claiming I'd found them while clearing brush. The agent identified them as yarrow, Oregon grapefruit, and wild ginger, all plants with medicinal properties. Traditional remedies for livestock ailments, she said, especially effective as natural antibiotics. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Something was living on my land, and it was trying to help. The exchanges continued through the summer and into fall. Every few days I'd leave something at the boulder, fresh vegetables from my garden, day-old bread, sometimes jerky or dried fruit. The offerings were always taken, and something was always left in return. Bundles of kindling, perfectly sized for my wood stove. Smooth river stones stacked in careful pyramids. Once, a deer hide, expertly scraped and cured, better than anything I could have done myself. I was communicating with something, though I had no name for what that communication meant. By October, I'd started noticing patterns. The repairs to my property always happened at night. The offerings were collected between dusk and dawn. Whatever was out there operated in darkness, in the hours when I was supposed to be asleep, when the world belonged to things that preferred to remain unseen. I found myself staying up later, watching from my bedroom window that faced the north pasture, seeing nothing but feeling watched in return. Then, in early November, I discovered the stone stack near the barn. It wasn't like the small cairns that had been left at the boulder. This was deliberate, almost architectural. 17 stones, ranging from the size of my fist to the size of a truck tire, balanced in a spiral pattern that seemed to defy gravity. It had been constructed just outside the barn door in a spot I passed every single morning. There was no way I could have missed it being built, which meant it had gone up in the few hours between my last check of the cattle at 10 p.m. and my first check at 5 a.m. The precision required, the strength needed to move some of those stones. It wasn't human work. Winter arrived hard that year. The first real snow came on December the 18th, dumping nearly 2 feet overnight. I woke to a world transformed. Everything buried under heavy, wet snow that made even walking exhausting. Around noon, I bundled up and headed out to check on the herd. Cattle don't do well in deep snow, and I was worried about the older cows, especially Bessie, who'd calved in late October and was still nursing. I found her in trouble about a quarter mile from the barn, trapped in a drift that had piled up against a fallen log. She was on her side, exhausted from trying to stand, her calf nearby making distressed sounds. I was alone, and Bessie weighed close to 200 pounds. There was no way I could move her by myself, not through 2 feet of snow. I ran back for rope for the tractor, my mind racing through options that all seemed impossible. When I returned 10 minutes later, there was someone else there. The figure from the tree line stood next to Bessie, but this time it wasn't watching from a distance. It was helping. As I approached, moving slowly through the snow, I watched this massive creature position itself behind the cow, getting leverage, preparing to pull. It saw me, our eyes met across maybe 15 feet of white landscape, and for a moment, everything stopped. Then it made a sound, low and questioning, and gestured toward the rope in my hands. I understood. We were going to do this together. I moved to Bessie's front end, talking softly to her, calming her, and secured the rope around her chest, behind her front legs. The creature watched, then took position at her hindquarters. It didn't need rope. It simply gripped her with those enormous hands, and when I pulled, it pushed. Together, we dragged 1,200 pounds of terrified cow through deep snow to level ground. It took 20 minutes of brutal effort, my lungs burning, sweat freezing on my face despite the cold. When Bessie was safe and standing, shaking but alive, I turned to thank whoever or whatever had helped me. It stood there, steam rising from its body in the cold air, and I got my first clear look in daylight. The face was broad, flat-nosed, with a heavy brow ridge and dark, intelligent eyes that held something I can only describe as knowing. Its body was covered in hair the color of weathered bark, longer around the shoulders and head, shorter on the massive forearms. It had to be 8.5 feet tall, with shoulders that would make a grizzly look small. And it was breathing hard, just like me, from the same exertion we'd just shared. I raised one hand slowly, a gesture of thanks. It watched me for a long moment, then mimicked the gesture, raising its own hand. Then it turned and walked away through the snow, leaving prints that would fill with fresh powder within the hour. That night, I started seeing the other tracks. Not just the large prints I'd been finding, but smaller ones. Juvenile prints, maybe 3/4 the size, and different adult prints, narrower, possibly female. I began mapping them in a notebook, tracking the locations, the sizes, the patterns of movement. What I discovered was territory. The northern 40 acres of my property, the densest forest section with rocky outcroppings and natural cave formations, was home to multiple individuals, a family group. Over the following months, I caught glimpses of them. A smaller figure, more slender, moving through trees at dawn. What looked like 2 juveniles playing, visible for just a moment at the edge of a clearing before vanishing. The large male I'd worked with became a regular presence, always at a distance, always watching over the herd like some kind of guardian. I started thinking of him as granite because of the gray streaks I'd noticed in his darker fur, like granite veins running through stone. By spring of 1985, I'd mentally cataloged 8 distinct individuals. Granite, the large male, a female I called Willow, for the graceful way she moved through the forest. At least 4 juveniles of varying sizes, and what appeared to be another adult, possibly an older female. They lived in the forest, used my land as part of their territory, and somewhere along the way, we'd developed an unspoken arrangement. I kept leaving offerings at the boulder, but now I understood what I was doing. This wasn't charity or curiosity. This was rent. I was acknowledging that they'd been here first, that this land was as much theirs as mine, and in return, they did something remarkable. My fences stayed intact. My cattle were never bothered by the mountain lions or coyotes that plagued other ranches in the area. Equipment that should have broken down kept working, often with mysterious repairs I couldn't explain. The land itself seemed healthier, the grass in the north pasture particularly lush, the creek running clearer than it had in years. My neighbors started commenting on my luck. Ed Morrison stopped by one afternoon in June, looked at my thriving cattle, my well-maintained fences, and shook his head. "Your daddy would be proud, Bob," he said. "You're running this place better than he ever did, and he was the best rancher I knew." I thanked him, didn't mention that I had help he couldn't imagine. By summer's end, the farm was actually making money. Not much, but enough to make the mortgage payments with something left over. I'd gone from the edge of bankruptcy to stability in just over a year, and I knew exactly why. They were protecting my investment because I was protecting theirs. We'd made a deal without ever speaking a word, and it was working. Over the next decade, we developed routines that felt as natural as the changing seasons. Winter meant they'd help clear snow from the access roads. I'd wake to find paths cut through overnight drifts, wide enough for my truck, the snow piled in neat banks on either side. Spring brought a different kind of assistance. More than once, I'd find myself guided to injured livestock I hadn't known were hurt. A broken branch arranged across a trail, pointing like an arrow toward a cow with an infected hoof, or a calf tangled in old wire fence I'd missed during my inspections. Summer of 1987, I learned they could warn me about fire danger. California summers are dry, and that year was worse than most. I found arrangements of broken branches near the house, placed in patterns I didn't understand at first. Dried grass woven between them, positioned to catch my attention. It took me 3 days to realize what they were showing me. Fire risk, high fire risk. I cleared brush around the buildings, created fire breaks I'd been putting off. 2 weeks later, a lightning strike started a blaze 5 miles south. The fire breaks I'd made saved my property while 2 neighboring ranches lost outbuildings. I was learning to read their signs the way my father had taught me to read weather patterns. Specific rock arrangements meant danger, usually trespassers or predators in the area. Certain vocalizations, low and resonant, meant gratitude. Sharper, higher-pitched sounds meant warning. We were developing a language built on observation and repetition, and I was starting to understand just how intelligent they really were. The juveniles were growing. By 1989, the smallest ones I'd first seen were nearly adult-sized, and there were new young ones, smaller, more curious. One in particular, with fur that was almost reddish in the right light, started leaving me gifts. Interesting rocks, polished smooth by river water, perfect pine cones, still closed tight. Once, an entire collection of different colored feathers, arranged by size. I kept them all in a wooden box on my dresser, proof that I wasn't imagining any of this. Then came the drought of 1991. By July, we hadn't seen rain in 4 months. The creek that ran through my property was down to a trickle, barely enough to water the herd. I was hauling water from town, spending money I didn't have, watching my cattle lose weight in the heat. Other ranchers were selling off their herds early, taking losses. I was close to doing the same when Granite appeared. He came right up to the fence line in broad daylight, something he'd never done before. He made a sound, urgent and insistent, then started walking toward the forest. He stopped, looked back, waiting. I understood. He wanted me to follow. I grabbed a canteen and went after him, climbing through terrain I'd never explored. Too steep and rocky for cattle, too dense with forest for easy passage. We walked for nearly 30 minutes, Granite moving ahead, checking back to make sure I was keeping up. He brought me to a hidden spring I never knew existed. Water bubbled up from between rocks, clear and cold, forming a small pool before trickling away underground. It was on my property, maybe 200 yards from where my creek started, and it was flowing strong despite the drought. Granite pointed to it, then pointed back toward where my cattle grazed. The message was clear. This water could save my herd. I spent the next week digging a channel, laying pipe, creating a system to redirect some of that spring water to my existing water sources. The cattle drank deep and started gaining weight again. My neighbors couldn't understand how I still had water when everyone else was struggling. I just told them I'd gotten lucky, found an old spring my grandfather must have known about. They believed me because the alternative was impossible. After that, Granite let me closer to their living areas. Not all the way in, there were still boundaries I understood not to cross, but closer than before. I saw where they bedded down in the heat of summer, in caves that stayed cool even in August. I saw food caches, supplies stored for harder times. I saw tools, crude but effective, rocks shaped for specific purposes, branches worn smooth from repeated use. The farm was thriving now. By 1993, I was running 150 head of cattle, had replaced all my aging equipment, and was putting money in the bank for the first time since my father died. Neighbors started asking for advice. How did I keep my cattle so healthy? What was my secret for such productive land? I'd smile and talk about crop rotation, about letting pastures rest, about paying attention to what the land was telling me. All true as far as it went. I just didn't mention who'd taught me those lessons. That same year, I ran into my first real test of the arrangement. 2 hunters showed up on my property in November, following a buck they'd wounded. I found them on the north boundary, close to where I knew Granite's family spent most of their time. They had rifles, expensive gear, and an attitude that said they went where they wanted. I told them they were trespassing, that this was private land, clearly posted. They ignored me, said they'd be gone soon, just needed to track their deer. I stood my ground, told them to leave immediately or I'd call the sheriff. They argued, got aggressive, but I didn't back down. Eventually, they left, cursing me, threatening to report me for obstruction. I didn't care. As they drove away, I looked toward the ridge above us and saw Granite standing there, partially hidden by trees, watching the whole thing. He'd seen me choose their safety over keeping peace with my own kind. The next morning, I found a perfect set of shed elk antlers at the boulder, bigger than any I'd ever seen. It was thanks, respect, and recognition all at once. Over the following years, I came to realize something profound. They weren't just living on my land, they were managing it with me, teaching me things I never would have learned from agricultural college or extension agents. Which areas needed to rest, how to read animal migration patterns, where to find medicinal plants when cattle got sick. My farm became the most productive in the county, and people credited my education and hard work. But I knew the truth. I had partners who'd been stewarding this land long before my family ever claimed it, and they were showing me how to do it right. Late autumn of 1995 brought pneumonia that hit me harder than I expected. What started as a chest cold turned into something that left me bedridden for 3 weeks, fever spiking every night, lungs feeling like they were filled with concrete. I was 39 years old and alone on 640 acres, with 150 head of cattle that needed daily care. The doctor in town prescribed antibiotics and rest, told me to get help with the ranch work. But there was no one to call. Hiring hands cost money I'd rather save, and I'd always prided myself on managing alone. By the end of the first week, I was too weak to do more than stumble to the bathroom and back. I'd lie in bed, listening to the cattle lowing in the distance, worrying about water troughs freezing, about feed running low, about everything falling apart because I couldn't get up. The guilt was almost worse than the sickness. On the 8th day, I forced myself out to the barn, made it about halfway before my legs gave out. I woke up on the ground 2 hours later, cold and disoriented, and barely managed to crawl back inside. But something strange was happening. Every morning when I'd drag myself to the window, I'd see evidence that work was being done. Feed had been distributed to the pastures, hay scattered in amounts that matched what I usually gave. Water troughs were full, ice broken and cleared. Gates that I'd left open were properly secured. At first, through my fever haze, I thought maybe Ed Morrison had come by to help. But Ed couldn't do this kind of work anymore, and his truck never appeared in my driveway. On the 10th day, I witnessed something impossible. From my bedroom window at dawn, I watched as my entire herd was moved from the south pasture to the north pasture, a task that normally took me and 2 hired hands a full day of work. They moved as a group, guided by shapes I could barely make out in the early light, large figures that kept to the shadows but clearly knew exactly what they were doing. The cattle weren't spooked or running. They moved calmly, deliberately, like they trusted whoever was moving them. When the last cow passed through the gate, I saw Granite close it, his massive hands working the latch as easily as mine would. They were keeping my farm running. They were keeping me alive. When I finally recovered enough to go outside, I found something at my front door that made me sit down hard on the porch steps. Carefully arranged in a basket I recognized as one I'd left offerings in were medicinal plants. Not the usual herbs they sometimes left, but specific ones, fresh despite the late season. I took them to the doctor on my next follow-up visit, asked casually what they were. He identified them as traditional remedies for respiratory infection, said Native American healers had used them for generations, natural expectorants and anti-inflammatories. He asked where I'd gotten them with genuine interest. I told him I'd found them while clearing brush, same lie I'd been using for years. The debt I owed them had shifted. This wasn't about property maintenance anymore or mutual benefit. They had saved me when I was vulnerable, kept everything I'd built from collapsing. I started leaving better offerings after that. Fresh meat from town, quality supplies I knew they'd appreciate, but it felt inadequate, like there was no way to truly repay what they'd done. Summer of 1998 brought the revelation I'd been both expecting and dreading. Granite approached me one afternoon in July, closer than he'd ever come before, maybe 10 feet away. He seemed agitated, pacing slightly, making sounds I'd never heard from him. There was something he needed to show me, something he needed me to understand. I followed him deep into the forest, to a spot near one of their cave dwellings where I'd never been invited before. He stopped in a small clearing and turned to face me. Then, slowly and deliberately, he lifted his left arm and turned to show me his side. The fur there was disrupted, thinner, and underneath I could see scars. Deep, old scars that ran in rough lines across his ribs and down his back. They weren't from animal claws or natural injury. They were too straight, too precise. I'd seen wounds like that before, on cattle that had been caught in barbed wire, or, God help me, on deer that had been shot and survived. My stomach dropped. "Someone hurt you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Someone shot you." Granite made a low sound, affirmative. The tone I'd learned meant yes. He turned back to face me and began to communicate in a way he never had before, using his whole body to tell a story. He held his hand low to the ground, showing he'd been young. Then he held up both hands, fingers spread wide, opening and closing them. Many. A group. A family. He made walking motions with his fingers, movement through forest. Then he crouched low, made himself small, hiding. He pointed to his eyes, then gestured outward, watching. Then he formed his hands into a shape I recognized immediately, one that made my blood run cold, the shape of a rifle. He made the motion of aiming, then clapped his hands together sharply. Gunfire. My chest tightened. "Hunters," I said. "Hunters found your family." He made that affirmative sound again, but it carried such weight of grief that I felt tears sting my eyes. He continued, showing me through gesture what words couldn't convey. His family had been attacked. He'd been young, maybe adolescent. He showed me running, showed me falling, his hand tracing along those scars on his side. He'd been shot. Then he showed me something worse. Playing dead. Lying still while the hunters came close, examined what they'd done, talked among themselves. He'd survived by pretending to be a corpse. He showed me the hunters leaving, taking something with them. Bodies, his family's bodies. Then others coming, different people, official looking. They'd covered everything up, made it disappear like it never happened. That's when I understood. That's why they hid. That's why every sound of a truck engine made them alert. That's why Granite had watched me for months before making contact. Because humans hunted them. Because we'd always hunted them. "How long ago?" I asked, though I wasn't sure he'd understand the question. He showed me seasons passing, the gesture we'd established for years. Once, twice, 3 times. He kept going, showing me the cycle 9 times. 9 years before I met him in 1984. He'd been living alone, traumatized and hiding, for nearly a decade before he decided to take a chance on me. Before he decided that maybe, just maybe, one human might be different. The developer's letter arrived in March of 2004, typed on expensive letterhead from a timber company out of Portland. They were offering me $400,000 for the logging rights to my north 40 acres, the densest forest section of my property. It was more money than I'd see in 10 years of ranching, maybe more than I'd see in 20. The letter was polite, professional, mentioned sustainable harvesting practices and reforestation plans. They made it sound reasonable, even responsible. But that 40 acres was exactly where Granite's family lived, where their caves were, where I'd seen 3 generations grow up over the past 2 decades. I called the number on the letterhead and told them I wasn't interested. The man on the phone, someone named Mr. Welch, asked if I'd at least consider a meeting to discuss terms. I told him there were no terms. The land wasn't for sale, not for logging, not for anything. He thanked me for my time with a tone that suggested this conversation wasn't over. He was right. Within 2 months, I started seeing survey crews on my property boundaries. They'd show up unannounced, claiming they were checking county easements or updating property maps. I ran them off every time, threatened to call the sheriff for trespassing. They'd leave, but they'd always come back. By fall, the timber company had sent lawyers, letters about disputed boundary lines, about old access roads that might constitute public right-of-way, about how my refusal to cooperate was delaying important economic development for the region. In January of 2006, a full survey team showed up. 5 men with expensive equipment, claiming they had legal right to verify property lines. I met them at the gate with my truck blocking the road. We argued for 20 minutes before I called Sheriff Tom Whitmore, who I'd known since high school. Tom came out, reviewed their paperwork, and told them they needed to schedule this work with me in advance. They left angry, but 2 weeks later they came back with an appointment. I had no legal grounds to refuse. I escorted them personally, kept them on the southern sections of the property, away from the North 40. But even then, strange things happened. Their GPS equipment malfunctioned repeatedly. Batteries that should have been fully charged died within an hour. One surveyor swore he kept hearing sounds in the forest, voices, or something like voices, that made him so uneasy he refused to go into the tree line. By the end of the day, they'd completed maybe a quarter of what they'd planned. The crew chief complained about atmospheric interference and poor equipment. They never came back. The real trouble started in 2008. I found evidence of illegal hunters on my property in late October, right before deer season. Trail cameras mounted to trees deep in the north section, high-powered rifle cartridges on the ground near a makeshift blind. These weren't local hunters who'd wandered over a property line by accident. This was deliberate, professional. Someone was hunting something specific on my land, and I had a terrible feeling I knew what. I pulled down every camera I found, confiscated the equipment, and started patrolling more aggressively. On November 3rd, just after dark, I caught 2 men with night vision gear walking through my north pasture. They had rifles with scopes that probably cost more than my truck, expensive camouflage, serious equipment. I approached them with my spotlight and my shotgun, asked them what the hell they thought they were doing. They weren't apologetic. The taller one, maybe 40 years old with a scar across his chin, smiled at me like this was all a game. "We're tracking something," he said. "Something that's been seen in this area for years. We think it lives on your property." My blood went cold. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. "But you're trespassing and you need to leave now." The other one, younger, holding what looked like a thermal imaging camera, spoke up. "We know they're here, Mr. Cartwright. We've seen the tracks, heard the vocalizations. We've been researching this area for months." He pulled out a wallet and opened it to show me a stack of $100 bills. "We're prepared to pay you $10,000 for hunting access. Just 3 days. That's all we need." I raised my shotgun, not aiming at them, but making my intentions clear. "Get off my property right now, or I'm calling the sheriff and having you arrested for armed trespassing." We stood there in the darkness, my spotlight creating harsh shadows on their faces. For a moment, I thought they might refuse, might try to push past me. Then the taller one shrugged. "Your loss," he said. "We'll be back, with permission or without it." I called Sheriff Tom that night, reported them for trespassing. Tom came out the next morning, took my statement, said he'd increase patrols in the area. After he left, he pulled me aside by my truck. "Bob," he said quietly, "I've known you for 30 years. I've seen your property thrive when everyone else was struggling. I've heard the stories people tell about strange things happening out here." He looked toward the North Forest. "I don't know what you're protecting, and I'm not asking. But be careful, those men aren't the type to give up easy." In 2012, I found Willow injured near the creek. Her left leg was caught in what looked like a trap. Not the kind used for bears or coyotes, but something heavier, crueler. She'd managed to free herself, but the wound was bad, deep gashes where metal teeth had bitten into muscle. She was sitting against a tree, breathing hard, clearly in pain. Granite was with her, and when he saw me, he made a sound I'd never heard before, desperate and pleading. I ran back to the house and grabbed everything I had. Antibiotics I kept for cattle, veterinary supplies, clean bandages, antiseptic. I told myself I was treating livestock, filed it that way in my records. Over the next week, I visited her daily, changed her dressings, administered medication. Granite stayed close the entire time, watching over her, bringing her food and water. The younger ones kept their distance, but I could see them observing, learning that I was trying to help. When Willow finally recovered enough to walk without limping, Granite did something he'd never done in all our years together. He approached me directly, stood close enough that I could have reached out and touched him. He placed one enormous hand on my shoulder, gentle despite his strength, and looked me directly in the eyes. Something passed between us in that moment, an understanding deeper than any words could express. Gratitude, trust, and a bond that had been forged over decades of mutual protection. But the warning came in 2015. I was checking fence line in early spring when I found a trail camera mounted to a tree, brand new, professional grade, aimed directly at a game trail that I knew the family used regularly. I pulled it down, checked the SD card. It had been recording for 3 days. The footage showed Granite passing by twice, clear as day. Someone was seriously hunting them now, with technology and patience. I destroyed the card, smashed the camera, and knew with cold certainty that time was running out. The world was getting smaller, and there were fewer places left to hide. The heart attack warning came during my annual physical in early 2016. I was 60 years old, and Dr. Morrison, Ed's nephew who'd taken over the practice, looked at my test results with concern. "Your cholesterol is through the roof, Bob. You've got arterial blockage that worries me. You need to make some lifestyle changes, and we need to talk about what happens if you can't manage this place alone anymore." I drove home in silence, thinking about mortality for the first time in a real, pressing way. What would happen to them if I died? What would happen to this land? I spent the next month making phone calls, meeting with lawyers, asking questions I should have asked years ago. I found a conservation attorney in Sacramento, a woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in land trusts and conservation easements. I told her I wanted to protect my property from development, particularly the north 40 acres. I said it was about preserving wildlife habitat, about keeping the land as it had been for generations. All true as far as it went. Patricia helped me establish a permanent conservation easement on the property. It took 8 months of paperwork, surveys, and negotiations with the county, but by January 2017, the north 40 acres were legally protected as a wildlife corridor. No logging, no development, no human access beyond basic land management. The easement would survive even if I sold the property or died. It was permanent, binding, protected by law. The timber company sent one final letter, threatening legal action for economic damages. Patricia handled it, sent back documentation showing everything we'd done was completely legal. They never contacted me again. I'd won, but it had cost me almost everything I'd saved. The legal fees, the reduction in property value from the easement restrictions, it wiped out 20 years of careful financial planning. I didn't care. Some things matter more than money. In 2018, I made a decision that terrified me. Patricia had a daughter, Emma, who was 29 and working on her doctorate in wildlife biology. She was studying habitat preservation in the Cascades, writing her dissertation on wildlife corridors and species conservation. Patricia mentioned during one of our meetings that Emma was looking for field study sites. I invited her to visit my property. I didn't tell her about Granite's family. I couldn't, not directly. But I showed her the land, explained my commitment to keeping it wild, taught her the traditions I'd established, leave offerings of food at certain spots, respect specific areas as off-limits, pay attention to signs and changes in the environment. She listened with the kind of attention that told me she understood there was more to this than I was saying. Emma started visiting regularly, helping with land management, documenting the wildlife that used the property. She was smart, careful, and most importantly, she knew how to keep her mouth shut. Over months of working together, I watched how she moved through the forest, how she respected boundaries, how she noticed things that most people would miss. The family was watching too. I'd catch glimpses of them observing her from distances, evaluating, deciding. In the summer of 2019, I saw all 8 of them together for the first time in years. It was sunset, golden light filtering through the Douglas firs, and they were gathered in a meadow on the north section. 3 generations, the oldest ones I'd known since 1984, now gray and moving slower, and the youngest, barely adolescent, playing at the edge of the group. Granite stood at the center, still massive, still watchful. For just a moment they seemed to pose there, like they knew I was watching, like they wanted me to see them whole and together. Then they melted back into the forest, leaving only bent grass and the memory. The moment I'll never forget came in July of 2020 during the pandemic lockdowns. I'd been isolating on the farm for months, and Emma had taken over most of the physical work I used to do. My heart wasn't what it used to be, and she'd insisted I slow down. One morning, I walked out to find Granite waiting near the barn, closer to the buildings than he'd been in years. He wasn't alone. A younger male stood beside him, nearly as large, with the same gray-streaked fur. His son, I realized, the next generation. Granite led his son to the boulder where I'd been leaving offerings for 36 years. He showed him the spot, showed him how to check for food, showed him me, standing on my porch watching. Then Granite looked directly at me and made a gesture we'd established decades ago, hand to tree, hand to chest, home, self. He was introducing his son to the human who could be trusted, passing down knowledge that might keep them alive after he was gone. I raised my hand in acknowledgement, in promise. The young male watched me carefully, wary but not fleeing. They stayed for a few minutes, then disappeared into the forest together. I stood on that porch long after they left, understanding what I'd witnessed: legacy, continuity, hope. I had surgery in 2023, a triple bypass that took more out of me than I wanted to admit. Emma stayed at the farm for 3 months, managing everything while I recovered. When I was strong enough to walk again, I found something at my front door that brought tears to my eyes. A walking stick, carved smooth from use, exactly my height. The wood worn dark from what must have been years of handling. Someone had left it for me, knowing I'd need it. Now, I'm 68 years old, still on this land, still keeping my promise. Emma visits twice a week, has taken over most of the heavy work. We've never discussed what she suspects, but I see how carefully she maintains the traditions, how she watches the North Forest with knowing eyes. The offerings still go out 3 times a week, and they're still taken. The repairs still happen, though less frequently now. They're aging too, I think, the ones I first knew. But there are younger ones now, tracks that show new generations. Last week, I left a bucket of apples at the boulder, same as I've done for 40 years. I walked away slowly, using my stick, and at the tree line I looked back. Just for a moment, I saw movement in the shadows, a flash of reddish-brown fur, the size suggesting one of the younger ones. The bucket would be empty by morning. It always is. Some of my neighbors still think I'm crazy, talking about wildlife management and land stewardship like it's personal. They don't understand why I turned down $400,000, why I spent my savings on legal fees to protect land I could have sold. Let them think what they want. Every morning I wake up on this property, I know I made the right choice. They protect my land, I protect theirs. Some arrangements don't need words, don't need contracts or signatures. They just need 2 sides willing to honor them, year after year, generation after generation. And every morning when that bucket's empty and my fences are still standing, I know the arrangement holds,